denying the obvious, manipulating numbers and facts, creating an alternative version of events. For almost a quarter of a century in power, Putin has made lies his main driving force in support. This applies to everything: foreign policy, the economy, assessments of international events. Why are so many people worried that Putin might once again use both negotiations and a meeting with Trump for just one purpose: to drag out the war? Let's break it down. In the war against Ukraine, the Kremlin's lies have reached truly astronomical proportions, both in terms of cynicism and brazenness. In 2014, Putin claimed that there were no Russian troops in Crimea, and that the so-called Little Green Men were actually local self-defense forces. Just a few months later, in an interview with Russian media, he boasted that he personally oversaw the course of this military operation. The Kremlin's propaganda used the same playbook when it came to the events in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. A few days before the full-scale invasion by the Russian army, the Kremlin dictator insisted that he had no intention of attacking Ukraine, and that the troops near the border were just conducting exercises. And on February 24, 2022, when the Russian army was bombing Ukrainian cities, he also said this phrase:
"We have no plans to occupy Ukrainian territory. We are not going to impose anything on anyone by force."
By September 30th, Putin had already signed fake and legally useless decrees on the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Just like that, on paper, they declared the occupied territories to be Russian, both those where fighting was still ongoing, and those that were and remain under Kiev's control. Even when peace talks began in Istanbul and Trump was saying he hoped for a quick end to the war, Putin declared that he was considering the creation of a buffer zone, which, according to his plan, should include the Sumy and Kharkiv regions, and he hinted that his ambitions wouldn't stop there.
Well, you know, we have this it's not a saying, not a parable, but an old rule. Wherever the Russian soldier sets foot, that's ours.
The Kremlin dictator's entourage has always tried not to fall behind him in anything. For example, the deputy chairman of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has repeatedly stated that Russia's territory could expand through so-called new regions as early as 2025. He says, after all, we already have experience with annexation, so there's no reason to stop.
By the way, this experience might come in handy again if our country ends up with new regions that are, as they say, very close to us. After all, it's possible.
Russian diplomacy has long since turned into a tool for propaganda and blackmail. Just remember the speech by Russia's permanent representative to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia. He talked about mythical American biolabs in Ukraine, tried to scare people with deadly combat mosquitoes and a dirty bomb. He claimed that British intelligence allegedly staged the mass killings of civilians in Bucha, which was occupied by the Russians. When the Russian army blew up the Kakhovka Dam, he blamed everything on Kiev and even called on the UN Secretary-General to condemn these actions. And when local residents were being buried in the village of Hroza in the Kharkiv region, mostly women and the elderly, Nebenzia delivered an absolutely monstrous speech. Let me remind you, in October 2023, a Russian missile deliberately struck a cafe where people had gathered for a memorial service.
As is known, at the moment of the strike, the funeral of one of the high-ranking Ukrainian nationalists was taking place there. Naturally, many of his neo-Nazi accomplices were present as well. It's no coincidence that in the photos published on social media right after the strike, almost all the bodies shown belonged to men of conscription age.
Mr. Deception, the Unsinkable, the Master of Manipulation, these are the titles that the Western press has, at various times, bestowed upon Nebenzia's boss, Sergei Lavrov. Over the years in his position, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry has had to lie and twist the truth many times. Although, for some reason, the Kremlin calls this diplomatic work. Here's one of the latest examples. At a meeting with students, Lavrov claimed that Russia is supposedly fighting the war against Ukraine alone, without a single ally. At the same time, even at the official level, Moscow has admitted that soldiers from North Korea are fighting against the armed forces of Ukraine on the side of the Russian Federation. And weapons from North Korea and Iran are coming not in small quantities, but by the trainload. Moreover, even in the midst of the negotiation process, Lavrov stated that U.S. sanctions do not scare Russia and, in fact, that President Trump makes decisions under pressure.
We really want to. We want to understand what motivates the President of the United States. It's clear that he is under enormous, I would even say, indecent pressure from the European Union and the current NATO leadership, who are brazenly supporting Zelensky's demands.
Of course, everyone in the White House sees and understands all of this. And Trump's rhetoric toward Putin has changed dramatically over the past few months. After yet another massive shelling of Ukraine, he called the Kremlin dictator absolutely insane. After all, in phone conversations he would say one thing, but in reality he acted completely differently.
I've spoken with Putin many times. We got along very well. We spoke 5 times, or maybe 4 times. You and I, Prime Minister Starmer, also discussed this issue and thought we had resolved it many times. And then Putin comes out and launches missiles at some city, for example, at Kiev, killing many people. I am very disappointed in Putin. Those 50 days I gave him, I would now shorten to a much smaller period, because I know the answer to the question, what will happen next?
At the same time, it's important to note that Russia never agreed to the ceasefire that Kiev and the United States insisted on. During all 3 rounds of negotiations in Istanbul, Putin's representatives kept putting forward completely unfounded demands. And Putin himself, who actually initiated the meeting in Turkey at the leaders' level, simply didn't show up. But at the same time, Moscow is afraid of angering Trump once again, and U.S. sanctions, both against Russia itself and its trading partners, could be devastating for the aggressor country's economy.
It seems that Russia is now more inclined toward a ceasefire. The pressure on them is working. But the main thing is that they don't deceive us or the United States in the details. We have proposed that, in the near future, our representatives from Ukraine and our partners, our security advisors, hold discussions to determine our position, our common stance, and a shared point of view. For us, for Ukraine, this is very important. Ukraine will definitely defend its independence, and we all need a long-lasting and reliable peace. Russia must end the war that it started itself.
Proceeding in the details is Moscow's tactic in all negotiations. Instead of discussing pressing issues, they steer the conversation into areas where, for example, the U.S. has little information and will need time to verify things. Distorting facts to suit their own interpretation, throwing in unexpected information, all these maneuvers are already well known both to Kiev and to our partners. The goal is simple: to lie in order to keep waging war against Ukraine. But everyone is really counting on the Kremlin not being able to pull this off anymore.